Hey everyone, welcome to tonight's webinar. I am so happy you guys are starting to introduce yourselves in the chat. The first thing I was going to ask you to do was to let me know where you're from so I can get an idea of the various locations and stuff. So I am in Illinois and I see Catherine is in Illinois, and we've got Tennessee, Ottawa, Australia, Mexico, Southeast Texas. Yay, Southeast Texas. I grew up down there. So I'm just scrolling. Puerto Rico, lots of places. And awesome. Indiana, Northeast Texas, Fayetteville, Arkansas, Oklahoma. Cool. All right. Well, we are going to get started. I am notorious for just constantly adding to presentations. So I actually don't like to practice too much because when I do, I wind up just adding so much stuff. I got up to 36 slides today when I was working with this. So hopefully this will not be too long. It will be recorded, and tonight we will be sending out an email. Sorry, I just realized my microphone was over here. We will be sending out an email tonight with a link to the recording in case we don't finish. My goal is always to do these in an hour. However, that doesn't always happen. And I also like to be sure that I am able to answer all the questions. That is really important to me. Because I don't like people to leave with unanswered questions. So I am going to try to share my screen right here. So is everybody seeing the parasite control in goats slide? I just want to make sure y'all are seeing the slide before I get going too much. So if you could just let me know in the chat, yes, you see the slides. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to hide myself down there in the corner so that you can see the slides better, especially if you're watching on something small like your phone or something like that. So, all right. Let's get started then. Let me see. That is very strange that there is nothing there. Okay. So just want to briefly say that you're in the right place tonight. There's a lot of different people who might find tonight's webinar helpful. One is if you're new to goats and you want to avoid parasite problems. That's my favorite because avoiding parasite problems is definitely the easiest and the least painful way to do things. If you've had goats for a while and you've already started to experience resistance to one or more of the dewormers and you're having problems, definitely happy that you're here. If you've been deworming on a schedule, I'm glad you're here, because if you haven't had problems yet, you will, unfortunately, they will start for most people, unless you've got extenuating circumstances. If you've been in my world for very long, you know the one phrase that I say more often than anything else is, it depends. But deworming in a schedule means one of two things. One, you're either going to have resistance soon and big problems, or two, you're just wasting a lot of money on dewormers that you don't actually need. So if you've been deworming all of your goats at one time, we're going to talk about why that's a bad idea. If you've had goats die from worms, obviously it's really, really important that you're here and that you learn some more information about how to prevent that from happening again. And it's awesome. You are in the right place if you do not want to learn everything the hard way, because that's how we did it. And I really don't recommend that. So what can you expect tonight? We're going to talk about why goats are more we are going to talk about why goats are more vulnerable to worms than sheep or cattle. We're going to talk about how to use natural resistance and resilience to your advantage. We're going to talk about why pasture management is key. And we're going to talk about how you can stop wasting money and worrying constantly. You can save money on dewormers, save money on fecals, and at the same time have confidence that your goats are not going to unexpectedly drop dead from worms. So learning it all the hard way. Like I said, that was how I did it. And I really don't recommend that because it's just not fun. So what we did, which was not a good way to do it, was we bought our first goats in 2002. We were clueless city slickers and did not know anything. I was under this assumption that goats had survived since the beginning of time and that we were just going to do everything organically. We could just put them out there on the pasture and they would take care of themselves because that's what they do in nature, right? And there's a picture of our first 4 goats that we bought when we got started in 2002. In 2004, we lost our first buckling to worms. And the vet told me after that I should be deworming my bucks every month. And so I did. I started doing that. And 4 months later, we lost 2 more of our bucks, adults. And in fact, that little gold and white guy there in the front, that was the first buck we ever bought. And he was one of the bucks who died 4 months after that buckling did. And a month later, we almost lost another buck. And I rushed him down to the university at 9 o'clock at night, paid an emergency visit bill, and did save him, but he lasted less than another year before he ultimately died. This is not a good way to do things. But a lot of people do wind up with goats dying from worms. It's actually barber pole worm is the #1 cause of death among goats. And things actually got worse for us because it went from our bucks to our does. And so then we started losing does. And within 4 years of buying our first goats, we had complete dewormer resistance. So by 2006, quite literally, the only thing, like I would just sit there and watch my goats die. And this is where my education on parasites really started, because when you've got goats dying and the drugs don't work, you will try everything that anybody says. And so I did. I tried all kinds of herbal dewormers and apple cider vinegar and Shackley Basic Age and all the things. And none of that stuff works. So it's very interesting. And I'll explain tonight why people frequently think that things work, even though they don't. So what were the things that we were doing wrong that we wound up with complete dewormer resistance within 4 years of moving onto our farm? First of all, we dewormed on a schedule because the vet told me to do that. We used the wrong dosage of dewormers because at that time, we did not have all the research that we needed to know what the correct dosage was. We do have the correct dosages now based on independent research, because none of there's only 2 dewormers labeled for goats. So most of them, we really need independent research to tell us what dosage of dewormer actually works for goats, because their metabolism is different than sheep and cows. So we were using either the sheep or cattle dosage of dewormer. And so we were underdosing, and that's why they didn't really work very well. And then they stopped working completely. We dewormed all of our does after kidding, and we kept our goats all on one pasture because we didn't really have any experience with this. And, like if you go to the zoo, what you frequently see are, animals in a small pen. And so none of us have really heard of pasture rotation or anything, or thought about how completely unnatural it is to keep animals in a small pasture or pen. But we also did some other things wrong. We dewormed all of our goats before moving them to a new pasture. Interestingly enough, in the early 2000s, that was considered like the new thing. Like, oh, let's do pasture rotation, give everybody a dewormer, and then move them to a new pasture. And that is actually a bad idea. And we'll talk about that in a minute. We dewormed all the goats when only a couple had a high parasite load. And that's because, people said that, oh, if one goat has worms, it just makes sense that they all would, right? Well, actually, the truth is all goats do have worms unless they are living in a sterile room. But unlike cats and dogs who are living in our houses, we don't need to kill every single worm in our goats. In fact, it's actually not desirable to do that. And we'll talk about why. We could have done worse. We didn't make all the mistakes. We did not initially deworm all the goats 10 days after the first deworming. I know a lot of people still hear that one, that you're supposed to deworm the goats more than once, but that's not a good idea. And we also didn't inject dewormers. And the reason we didn't inject dewormers had nothing to do with the fact that it leads to resistance, which it does, and I'll talk about that more. The reason we didn't inject dewormers is because the thing that got passed around back then in the Yahoo groups was that injecting dewormers into goats caused seizures. And a vet injected a dewormer into one of my bucks one time, and I seriously thought that the goat was having a seizure because injectable dewormers burn. And so I can see why people thought that their goats were having seizures, because he screamed bloody murder and threw himself down on the ground and was rolling on the ground. And I was freaking out because I thought the goat was having a seizure because that's what I've heard would happen. And I said that to the vet and he started laughing and said, no, goats are just wimps. He's not having a seizure. It just stings. And so I was not a fan of that vet telling me that my goat was a wimp and laughing at my concern. But injecting dewormers, you should never inject dewormers in a goat because they last a really long time. And I have a whole slide dedicated to that in a minute. So what is our life like today for our goats? Well, we no longer have goats dying from worms. We haven't in a really long time. We give a dewormer to less than 10% of our goats every year. And usually it's just yearlings after kidding or bucks that we have purchased. Most of the goats in my herd now have great natural resistance and resilience. However, I do bring in a new buck or two about every 4 or 5 years. I have not bought any does since 2005. But about every 4 or 5 years, I bring in a new buck or two. And a lot of those bucks have worm problems. So it's always a reminder to me that I've done a good job in terms of breeding goats that are naturally resistant and resilient. Most of our goats today have never had a dewormer in their lives. And since we've been doing this, it's been 15 plus years since I've learned about all of this. And we have only lost 2 goats to parasites in more than 15 years. And both of those were due to human error. So basically errors in pasture rotation. That was the problem. So how did we get to this point? Well, we started reading the research and following the recommendations. We have the answers. The problem is most people don't have access to scholarly journals. Most vets do not see enough goats to include goat education as part of their continuing education. Vets have to get a certain number of continuing education credits, but nobody tells them you have to get it in goats. And so if a vet mostly sees dogs and cats, that's where they're going to get most of their continuing education. Unfortunately, a lot of vets think that goats are just like sheep, or they think that goats are little cows. So they think that whatever they learned in vet school about cows or sheep is going to apply to goats. And that's very, very wrong, especially when it comes to parasites. And so I was lucky because I was actually teaching college. I have a master's degree in communication. And when you teach college, you get access to the college library. So when my goats were dying and vets couldn't help me, I actually started looking for the research to see what we could do to help our goats. And so I read the research and I followed the recommendations, and they work. Like the research is right, and what the research leads us to do is correct. So why are goats different? Well, cows and sheep are grazers. That means they graze, they eat off the ground. Their bodies have evolved through thousands of years to eat off the ground, and goats have not. Goats are browsers, meaning that they prefer to eat leaves off of bushes and trees. And there are no worm larvae up in the trees. The worm larva is all on the ground where the animals are pooping. So the animals are pooping out worm eggs, they hatch on pasture, and then they turn into larvae, and then they are on the grass, and the goats consume the grass and they get infected. And the longer they stay on grass, the more larvae they ingest and the worse it gets. And so goats struggle more than sheep and cows because that grazing is not their natural way of eating. It's not their natural way of living. And so they don't have the same immune system when it comes to worms. These are actually my cows and my sheep in these pictures here. And you see they're on very short grass. My I had Shetland sheep for 12 years. I've had Katahdins now for the last 12. And for the Shetlands and the Katahdins, none of them have almost ever had a dewormer. And they're out there grazing on short grass all the time. In fact, we had a coyote problem one year when our goats were dying from worms. And so we wound up putting the sheep and the goats together, which I do not recommend. My goats were dying and getting skinny, and the sheep were fine. And they were on the same pasture, eating the same larva-covered grass as the goats. And the sheep were fine. I did not lose a single sheep to worms, but I had goats dying. And our cows, I have never given a dewormer to a cow in my life. And we had Irish Dexter cows for over 10 years, and they did fine. They're very big and beefy, and they don't need dewormers. So the way that goats avoid parasites in the wild is, first of all, goats were originally desert animals. And meaning like long time ago, they started out in the deserts of the Middle East. And then they did okay when, people took them to Europe and they were in the mountains because, so first of all, there is no grass in the desert, right? And so they were eating like shrubs and bushes and little trees, leaves. And when they were taken to most parts of Europe where there are mountains, there's lots of evergreens. And so they still were not eating much off the ground. They were mostly eating the evergreens, and that kept them from having any worm problems. However, in the United States, the reason goats have never become very popular here is simply because we don't have the natural, in most areas, we don't have the natural climate and forage for them to thrive. So, unless you're in like the deserts of Arizona and the Southwest, people out west in the mountains can do pretty well. But those of us in places like Illinois, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, we just have lots of grass and lots of rain, and that is barber pole heaven. So, so the biggest problem because we have dewormers that work. However, the worms get resistant to them. And the way that happens is because people use them incorrectly. And so to prevent dewormer resistance, we need to avoid overusing dewormers so that we can protect the refugia. And if you've never heard of refugia before, you're like, what on earth is that? Refugia is the proportion of a parasite population not exposed to dewormers, which remain susceptible to treatment. So it's the worms that have not been exposed to a dewormer, meaning that they have not developed resistance to it. The only way that worms become resistant to a dewormer is if they are exposed to it, because they get exposed to it and either it kills them or they survive. If it kills them, great. If they survive, that is not great for us because now they're resistant to it. You know, it's kind of like there's a lot of diseases that we get, and if we survive, now we're resistant to it. You know, a lot of us had chicken pox as children and we became resistant to it. So we're not going to get it again. So what does this mean in real life? So I've got some examples here for you. Now, I picked 10 goats for easy math. So if you have 10 goats and you give a dewormer to just one of those goats, that means that only 10% of the worms in your herd will be resistant to that dewormer. So one goat, which is 10% of your herd, is going to be out there pooping out eggs from worms that survived the deworming. The good news is that 90% of the goats are still out there pooping out worm eggs from worms that were never exposed to that dewormer. So you've got 90% refugia in your herd, and that's great. This is the goal. If you've got 10 goats, you really don't want to have to give a dewormer to more than one. If you've got 20 goats, you really don't want to have to give a dewormer to more than two. So you really want to keep that dewormer number under 10% for best results. If 5 of your 10 goats need to be treated, or you treat them, that means now that 50% of the worms in your herd are going to be resistant to that dewormer. And this is in your herd. This is not about in the individual goat. Sometimes people get confused and think we're talking about like in the individual goat, and we're not, because worms are not hatching inside of your goat. They're hatching on the pasture. So if you treat 5 of your goats, those 5 goats are going to be out there pooping on the pasture, and the eggs in their poop are going to hatch and mature into infective larvae that are resistant to the dewormer. So another goat in your herd who's never been treated is going to come along and eat the grass that's got that larva on it. And now they have those worms in their body that are resistant to the dewormer. So what happens if you only have 10 goats in your herd and you treat all 10 of them? And this is what a lot of people, pretty much everybody did this when I got started 24 years ago. And a lot of people still do this. Now you've got 100% of the worms in those goats is resistant to that dewormer, because if they were susceptible to it, it killed them. But if they survived, it means they're resistant now. So now 100% of your goats are pooping out worm eggs that are going to hatch and turn into resistant worms. Now, what if you only have 2 goats or 3 goats in a pen or in your whole herd? Like maybe you have 10 does and 2 bucks. Well, if you only have 2 bucks and one of them needs to be treated, that is 50% of the goats in that pen. So it's not just about the number of goats on your farm. It's about the number of goats in a pen or in a pasture. So keep that in mind when you're using dewormers, because it definitely gets more challenging if you've got fewer goats in a pen. I like to tell people that dewormer resistance is similar to antibiotic resistance, because most people are familiar with antibiotic resistance. So once upon a time, we thought that all bacteria was bad and we needed to kill them all. And, they handed out penicillin like it was candy. They overused them like crazy. And now we have antibiotic resistant bacteria. And in fact, when I went to grad school, one of my classmates' fiance died because he had an antibiotic resistant infection. He had MRSA, which is MRSA, which is methicillin resistant Staph aureus. And it killed him because they didn't have an antibiotic to treat the infection that he had. So it's the same thing happens with dewormers. If we overuse dewormers, then they all stop working. And we only have 3 classes of dewormers. And so that's why it's a lot easier to get dewormer resistance than it is to get antibiotic resistance. We have dozens of antibiotics, but we only have 3 classes of dewormers. So this is why you can't just say, oh, we'll just give them a different drug. Well, it's very possible to wind up with resistance to all 3 classes of dewormers. So now we're going to talk about the mistakes that you don't want to make. And one of those is deworming on a schedule. And I wanted to find what this means because I've had people tell me, oh, I don't deworm on a schedule. I just do it every month or every 2 months. And I'm like, that's a schedule. So if you are deworming based on the calendar, that's a schedule. And the more you use a dewormer, the faster parasites will become resistant to it because the fewer refugia your goats will have. Meaning the more worms that are resistant. And people originally did this with the incorrect assumption that they could prevent worm problems. And sadly, nothing online ever dies. You know, there's still websites out there. Like, people just don't delete this stuff when it gets old. So Google still sends you to websites that will tell you that you need to deworm, give a dewormer to all your goats every spring so that they won't have worm problems. That is very bad advice. And it's also very old advice. Like, that's what they were saying to do 20 years ago. They have been saying, don't do that for over 15 years now. So if we know better, we need to do better. Why not deworm the whole herd when only a couple have a parasite problem? Because this is what people used to say. They used to say, oh, well, it only makes sense if one has a worm problem, everybody's got them. Well, if you give a dewormer to the whole herd, now you have 0 refugia. So every single egg that's being pooped out of those goats contains larvae for worms that will be resistant. Why not deworm all of your goats before moving to a new pasture? This was actually what I was told to do with my bucks back 20 years ago. It's like, give them all a dewormer and then move them to a new pasture. And so we created 5 buck pens so that we could have 5 weekly, like every month. We thought this was so wrong. Every month that we would give them a dewormer and move them to a new pasture. And that is bad because when you move them into a new pasture, they are pooping out nothing but worms from the goats that survived the deworming. So if you deworm all the goats and then move them to a new pasture, that actually accelerates dewormer resistance. And they figured this out fairly quickly. This actually was not a recommendation for very long, maybe just a few years before they said, oh, oops, we were wrong. Don't do that. So, and then why not deworm all does after kidding? Because not all does need it, especially if you've been practicing other parasite management strategies. Usually in my herd, the only does that need deworming after kidding are the yearlings. And that's because we are asking that goat to do a lot. We are asking her, it's like, okay, yeah, we know you're just a yearling and you're still growing, but we want you to keep growing. We also want you to grow these kids. We want you to make milk for those kids, and we want you to fight parasites. That's a lot to ask of an animal. And so this is one reason I rarely breed yearlings. I prefer to wait to breed them until they're 2 years old, because when they're 2 years old, they usually do not need a dewormer after kidding. And the other thing is they make more milk. And so because I have Nigerians and a lot of them like to have more than 2, yearlings really cannot make enough milk for more than 2. 2-year-olds can. So that actually works much better. I saw a question in there about Pat Colby, and that, again, at the beginning I said I tried everything back in the beginning, or at least researched it. That is not a great system. Several people told me that they followed her stuff and that they had goats dying, some from copper toxicity, because she recommends copper sulfate, which is actually very high. It's very easy to wind up with copper toxicity if you use copper sulfate. So I never, ever, ever recommend that. I'm not going to be talking about copper tonight. That is like a whole hour-long conversation. But copper oxide is much safer. So why do you not deworm 10 days after the first deworming? Because this is another thing that I hear a lot from people, is that they think that they're supposed to deworm. And some people say 10 days, some people say 7 days, some people say 2 weeks. The reality is you don't need to do it a second time. People originally said to do this because they incorrectly assumed that eggs hatch inside the goat. And eggs do not hatch inside the goat. Eggs hatch on pasture because they need oxygen to hatch. And there's no oxygen if you're inside of a goat's digestive tract. So that's why they need to be on pasture to hatch. And larvae in the goats, and worms can be in hypobiosis inside of a goat, but it's very unpredictable. So once they learned about hypobiosis, which is similar to hibernation, but not exactly the same, but it's what it's called when worms do it inside of a goat. And when people first learned about it, they came up with the idea somewhere that they could assume, like, oh, well, the goats are going to come out of hypobiosis at X number of days. Well, nobody ever got any research on that. They just kind of assumed. Like, this is why you see different numbers all the time, like 10 days or 7 days or 2 weeks, and the reality is worm hypobiosis is unpredictable. So that second dewormer could be completely wasted. Like, you don't even know that there's worms in hypobiosis inside your goat. There may not be. And so it could be completely wasted. But the reality is that if you do it a second time, you're just exposing more worms to it and creating more worms. Any worms that survive that second deworming are going to be resistant too. So you've just created more dewormer resistant worms. The reality is that after you give a dewormer to a goat, you really need to be monitoring that goat's condition. And if it's not improving, you need to treat it with a different drug. Because if you just think, I've seen people say, oh, well, I'm going to wait 7 days or 10 days or 14 days to deworm again. The goat could die in 2 or 3 days if you're not keeping a close eye on it. So why not inject dewormers? I still hear this a lot too, unfortunately. There's 2 reasons. One is, if you have milk goats, if you look at the bottles of injectables, which are made for cattle, they say not to be used in animals producing milk for human consumption. And the reason is because, and it doesn't even give a milk withdrawal. And some people mistakenly assume, they're like, oh, if it doesn't say what the milk withdrawal is, that just means they haven't done the research. No, in this case, they have done the research. And tell me in the chat, do you want to dump milk for a month or 2 after treating your goat with a dewormer? Say, yay, me, I want to milk a goat and dump the milk for a month or 2 after giving a dewormer, because that's what you would need to do. Or otherwise, you're ingesting dewormer residue, because if you inject ivermectin, it stays in the milk for 40 days. So for 40 days, you're still going to have ivermectin in that milk. It is even worse for moxidectin, which is what is in sidectin. And Sidectin, the milk withdrawal is over 2 months. Like I don't remember what it is because like it's just crazy. Like who would want to milk a goat for 2 months and dump the milk? Nobody, which is why you should never, ever, ever inject a dewormer into a milk goat. The other reason that you don't want to inject it is because if it's in the milk, it's in other body tissues too. And it means that the worms are being exposed to it at a very low level. So for a month or two after you inject a dewormer, you are the worms in that goat's body. So like the goat goes out onto the pasture and picks up some worm larvae. For the next month or two, every worm that is living in that goat is going to develop resistance to that dewormer because it's being exposed to such a very low dosage of it. It's not enough to kill it, but it's enough to expose it so that it's like basically you're vaccinating the worms against the dewormer that you're using. And this is where it's really also really important to know the difference between cattle and goat metabolism, because these things were made for cattle, and the big claim to fame in them is that they are long range. In fact, one of them is even called long range. In the science world, they call them long tail, meaning they just stay in the animal's body for a long time. Apparently they do stay in the cow's body at a little higher level, but definitely does not work for goats in terms of continuing to kill the worms. It just doesn't. So don't use injectable dewormers ever. So I've told you a lot of things that you shouldn't do. And so you're probably sitting there going, well, what am I supposed to do? You should do the 5-point check and only treat sick animals. So antibiotics are drugs that you only give to sick animals. Dewormers are drugs that should only be given to sick animals. So we have to start looking at dewormers the same way we look at antibiotics and other drugs. You're not going to sit there and go, oh, I want to kill all the bacteria in my body, so give me some penicillin. Nobody says that. So why did we ever get the idea that we should give dewormers to all the goats to try and kill all the worms? Because first of all, that is a totally losing battle. You're not going to kill all the worms because the goats are eating off the pasture. That was one of the things one of the vet professors that I first met said to me 20 years ago. You will never get to 0 worms in an animal that eats off the ground. So that's one of the big differences between dogs and cats and goats, is because your dogs and cats should not be eating off the ground where there is dog and cat poop. And if they are, you're going to have problems there. So I'm sorry for all of this small print on this screen, but I will go through it. So a lot of people are probably wondering, why have I not talked about doing fecals? And the reality is that current research says you really don't need to do fecals. So the 5-point check, let me talk about the 5-point check. The 5-point check, you're checking the eye for anemia, which I think just about everybody has heard of the Famacha score. And so that's what you're checking, is that you're checking that lower eyelid to see what color it is. And if the goat is anemic, that a very common reason for anemia in goats is barber pole worm. Other worms, even other round worms, don't cause anemia. But the barber pole worm does. And so a good place to check that is the eye. But not every other worm causes that. So your goat could still have a worm problem, but not necessarily barber pole. Swelling under the jaw, which of course, that's hard to see in a buck with a big bushy beard. But if a goat has swelling that goes from the corner of their jaw down to their chin, it's kind of like swollen like a bottle. That's why they call it bottle jaw. That is another symptom of worms. This is different than like swelling over the middle of the throat, which would be thyroid, or just like an abscess under a little circular abscess, round abscess under the jaw, which could be CL. Bottle jaw is a long swelling from the edge of the jaw down to the chin. The body condition is the next thing you want to check. There are some roundworms that, because barber pole is a roundworm. So if your vet ever says your goat has strongyles or roundworms or whatever, it could be barber pole, but it could also be bankrupt worm or scour worm. And the funny thing about bankrupt worm, the nickname for that is that it got that name because it's not going to kill your goat, but it's going to bankrupt you because the animal is going to be too skinny to be productive. So body condition is really important. And then the tail, they say the tail is the other point, and you're looking for the condition of the goat's poop. Basically, they should be pooping pebbles. If they're pooping logs or have diarrhea, that could be a symptom of worms. Barber pole does not usually cause diarrhea. A lot of people just assume all worms cause diarrhea, and barber pole worm does not. So if you have a goat that doesn't have diarrhea, but it has anemia, don't rule out worms because it could be worms. And then the last thing to check on is coat condition, because a lot of goats with worms will look very scruffy. There's a couple of questions in the chat. Let me see. I don't like, oops, I don't know where my cursor is. I am going to mark some of these so that I can scroll back up. So Kathy and Marianne, I'll get back to your questions towards the end. Because how often should you rotate? That is very complicated. We have I do whole like 15, 20, 30-minute conversations with people about that because it's going to be different for everybody. So you want to check the goat. And this is basically how you know your goat is sick. Like if your goat is coughing, has a runny nose, snotty nose, then those are symptoms of a respiratory infection. These are symptoms of a parasite overload. And so you need to be able to recognize these symptoms the same way that you would recognize a snotty nose and a cough as a respiratory problem that needs attention. Oops, I got to get my cursor back on the right place. So why not just say, oh, we'll just do a fecal? I mean, there are people, I was shocked the other day. I saw a vet on Facebook that said, you should do a fecal every 3 months because a FOMACHA score doesn't tell you if your goat has anything other than barber pole. So I just so there's a vet that doesn't know anything about the 5-point check, because the FOMACHA score, I do not just ask somebody, what's your FOMACHA score on your goat? I want to know how did they score on the whole 5-point check? And if they have a poor body condition and diarrhea, even without anemia, so poor body condition and diarrhea probably means they have bankrupt worm or scour worm, which needs to be treated if your goat is skinny. So the reason that you don't just do fecals is, so first of all, I want to bust the biggest myth I see on social media, and that is people think you need to do a fecal to know which dewormer to use. And that is so completely incorrect. All dewormers kill all the roundworms, including barber pole, unless the worms on your farm are resistant to that dewormer. So I'm just going to say it again. All dewormers kill all the roundworms, including barber pole, unless the worms on your farm are resistant to that dewormer. So what you get then is you get people who are saying, oh, well, Safeguard doesn't kill barber pole worm. Well, Safeguard doesn't kill anything if it's been used at the wrong dosage. And unfortunately, the dosage on the bottle is wrong. If you give that to your goats, it's probably not going to kill them. And it's not, because, I mean, if you look at it, it says it's for roundworms. The reason I think that we got this confusion is because most people don't realize virtually all the intestinal worms of concern are roundworms. That's it. Barber pole worm, Ostertasia, scour worm, bankrupt worm, all of those. They are all killed by all 6 of the dewormers that are recommended by the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control. So you don't need a fecal to figure out which dewormer to use. The other thing is, and I know there's a whole Facebook group on this, and it's really sad because you have people on there trying to tell you that you've got these different roundworms, and the reality is you cannot tell the difference between the roundworms under a microscope. There are ways to do it, but you have to pay a lot of money for it, and it has to go to a special lab and all this kind of stuff. And you don't need to know. Like, it doesn't matter what kind of worm you have if it's an intestinal worm. So worms that have different treatment protocols and stuff would be like lungworms. Well, a lungworm is not going to cause the problems that we just talked about. That, like, a goat's not going to necessarily fail the 5-point check if it only has lungworms. It's going to be more likely like, oh, my goat is coughing and has a snotty nose. Does it have a respiratory problem? Does it have a respiratory infection, or does it have lungworm? So the kind of parasites that are that you have to then start getting really careful with, and liver flukes. Liver flukes, again, you're going to have some different kind of symptoms. And then a big one is coccidia. Coccidia is not a worm. And so I think this is where that one of the places people get confused is that they hear say, oh, well, you might need to do you need to do a fecal to figure out if it's worms or coccidia. That's really only true with kids, because coccidia, a healthy adult is immune to coccidia. So a healthy adult is going to have coccidia in their gut, but it's not making them sick. And so it's really irrelevant for an adult. It's with an adult, diarrhea in an adult is pretty much always going to be caused by worms, or it's not parasites. It's something else that needs more testing to figure out. The other one of the biggest frustrations to me is about people wanting to do fecals is that a goat could die while you wait to do a fecal. If it's Friday or Saturday and you suddenly realize that your goat, like, oh my goodness, my goat is really skinny and the eyelids are really pale, but I got to wait for a fecal. Well, your goat might be dead tomorrow, and you could have treated it today and possibly saved it. So the other thing is, and then the next point there, bullet point number 3, is that a goat could die if you think that you need to wait 7 days or 10 days to do a follow-up fecal. You don't need to do a follow-up fecal. If you treat a goat for worms, you need to be checking that goat every single day. You need to be checking their poop. You need to be checking their body condition. You need to be checking their eyelids. Also paying attention to their jaw, or, if they've got bottle jaw. And you need to be seeing improvement in those things, definitely not worsening. Because in addition to, like, maybe needing a different dewormer, your goat might also need a blood transfusion. If your goat has white eyelids, it might need a blood transfusion. And a lot of people are not familiar with this. And some vets are not, but it is absolutely an option. And I learned about this because one of my goats had a blood transfusion. Goats don't have blood types. And so any of your goats could serve as a donor for another goat. If you happen to have a big, healthy wether, that is the best option. You don't really want to use a doe that's in milk or pregnant, because they've already got a lot of demands on their body. And depending on what time of year it is, an intact buck may or may not be a good option. But wethers, if you've got a wether, they're always great. I've almost always had a wether on my farm, and they serve very important jobs. So, a goat. So another problem about goats with a fecal is that a goat that has high resilience, a goat that's very resilient, can have a fecal load of 1,000 eggs per gram or more and not be sick. And if you use a dewormer with that goat, it's going to add to the dewormer resistance on your farm, which means you're going to reduce the refugia by doing that. And so again, especially, like if you've got your bucks, say you've only got 3 bucks and you want to treat one of them, well, you've just treated 33% of the goats in that pen. And so, and that's going to affect all of your goats because they're all going to be ingesting the larva that goat, that hatches from the eggs that goat poops out. On the flip side, a goat with very low resistance can have a fecal of 300 eggs per gram and run up big vet bills. You can run up big vet bills looking for a problem other than worms, and the goat could wind up dead. Like I see this all the time. People are like, well, my goat has, it's failing the 5-point check, or it's skinny and is got diarrhea, but the vet says there's only a couple hundred or 300 eggs per gram, so it's not worms. I would treat that goat for worms because it could be like scour worm or bankrupt worm, because so this is the other thing too. You don't need to look under a microscope to look at the individual worm eggs to know that your goat has barber pole. If you've got egg counts in the thousands, the only worm that can do that is barber pole, because they are prolific egg layers. The first time I heard that a barber pole female could lay 10,000 eggs, I thought the speaker had to be wrong. There's just no way that could possibly be right. And I heard it a few more times. And then I saw, I have all these vet textbooks over here. Goat Medicine, which is like the Bible of goat textbooks by Mary Smith at Cornell University, says that a barber pole female can lay 10,000 eggs per day. So this is why you can get a fecal egg count in the thousands if a goat has barber pole worm. Those other roundworms, whose eggs look exactly the same under a microscope, only lay a few hundred eggs per day. So those other worms that cause diarrhea, that do not cause anemia, you're gonna just get low egg counts on them, much lower egg counts on the fecals. So fecals can really mislead you in a lot of ways. So somebody says, the internet says not to give valbazen to a nursing goat. That is completely wrong. So there is no dewormer that you cannot give to a nursing goat. They're all fine to give to nursing goats. Valbazen should not be given in the first trimester of pregnancy because it can cause birth defects and abortions. So some people just take a bit of information and run with it. But where do fecals fit in? Because the fecals can be used, but fecals should not be used in terms of deciding whether or not to treat a goat for worms and whether or not, which dewormer to use, because all of the dewormers kill all of the digestive worms of concern. So you might need to do a fecal if a kid has diarrhea, because it could be coccidia or worms. Coccidia is a protozoa, not a worm. So dewormer is not going to help with coccidia. You need a different drug for that. If you want to have a herd that is naturally resistant to worms, you can use fecals to make breeding and culling decisions. You just regularly do fecals on all of your goats and keep only goats with low fecal egg counts. And then if you don't want resilient animals on your farm, because remember, the resilient animals are the ones who can walk around with a couple thousand eggs and be perfectly fat and happy and healthy. Some people don't want those animals on their farm. So if you don't want those animals in your farm, you could use fecals to make culling decisions for them. I don't mind resilient animals on my farm. I think it's great, because I am not going to, an animal that's resilient and has a couple thousand eggs per gram is not going to be a problem for your other goats if you are rotating pastures correctly. You should never leave goats on grass that's less than 6 inches, because the worm larva is going to be on the lower 4 inches of grass. So if you're rotating your goats and moving them to the next pasture before the number of larvae on there mature, then it doesn't really matter. It's like, okay, we're taking the goats away, and we're going to leave behind all of the thousands and thousands of worm larvae to just dehydrate and die. How do you know which droppings belong to which goat? It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. So, yeah, Fred says, I've seen multiple does with white eyelids that the fecal does not show a high egg count. There are other reasons for anemia. However, if a goat is really anemic, any worms at all that they have is definitely going to be a problem. So, and Barbara says she uses fecals to see if a dewormer was effective. I don't. So with chemical dewormers, if the goat gets better, then I just assume it was effective. I have used fecals. So way back when we were using all the things, I used fecals because I used a lot of different herbs. And that's how I can say emphatically that the herbs did not work, because I did before and after fecals and there was no difference at all. Laura said, what if you don't have rotating pastures? You can do a dry lot. However, pasture rotation is a lot easier than most people think. Oh my goodness. I try not to get too wrapped up in the comments before I'm done. AI Gemini said, what is sticking to my goat's back end and clinging to poop is tapeworm segments. If it looks like rice or noodles, yes. But the funny thing about tapeworms is that tapeworms do not make goats sick. So one of the very first vets I knew, she was actually the FAMACHA instructor that I had way back 20 years ago. FAMACHA's been around a lot longer than most people think. She said tapeworms are worse for the mental health of the owner than for the physical health of the goat. And that is true. So what happens is somebody sees tapeworms and they take in a fecal and the vet says your goat has worms and they treat it. And if you treat, so tapeworms are only killed by the white dewormers. You have to give Safeguard or Valbazin for tapeworms. And this is why I said all of the intestinal worms of concern are killed by all of the dewormers, because tapeworms are not a digestive worm of concern, because they consume the contents of the intestines. So it's not going to hurt your goat. Theoretically, if a goat had so many tapeworms it could cause an intestinal blockage, everybody says this, it's in the vet textbooks, but I don't know anybody who's ever had a goat die because it had an intestinal blockage because it had so many tapeworms. Usually you only see kids pooping out tapeworms. You don't usually, I don't think I've ever seen an adult poop out tapeworms. And so the tapeworms don't make your goat sick. I did a podcast with a vet who, it's funny, so the Common But Unimportant Worms podcast, it's a great podcast. I loved it. The vet professor I interviewed for that I interviewed her in May and she had just retired. So she had been a vet for like 40, 45 years. And she also herself, she raised sheep. And we had a great fun talking about our tapeworm stories in there. And, she talked about how her, she sent off some sheep to either the auction or to the locker. And when her husband came back, the trailer was just covered with tapeworms. Just poop with tons and tons of tapeworms. And all of the sheep that she just sent in were all very fat and healthy. And so the tapeworms were not affecting it at all. And my funny story about tapeworms is that when my second goat book came out, this one, For the Love of Goats, the second edition, when that book came out, I was doing some TV shows, and I did this one show where I took a mom and her baby goat, and they were pooping in the studio, and everybody was completely freaking out. And because the goats were pooping in their studio, even though there were these perfect little pellets, and that's it. And then I took them home, and they were in dog crates in the back of my van. And when I took them out, that little doe, and this little doe was super fat and healthy. She dumped the biggest load of tapeworms I have ever seen before or since. And I was so relieved that she didn't do that in the TV studio, because everybody would have completely freaked out if that had happened, because it was quite obvious. There's like all of these like white segments in there that looks like it was like a bunch of pebbles, goat pellets with all of these white tapeworm segments in there. And she was as fat and healthy as could be. So do not worry about tapeworms. And this is why I try to stay away from the comments, because I tend to go off on a tangent, because I like to give everybody the full story. So tapeworms are not a problem for your goat. I will, I'm going to have to get back to some of these questions in a minute, because I got to get through the rest of this. And and by the way, there is no controversy over correct dosages, not among professionals, not among the researchers. What you see, if you see different numbers, a lot of them are just things people make up. Literally, I mean, I can't even tell you some of the crazy things that people have asked me, like, oh, is this right? Oh my God, no, you might kill your goat if you give them that much. So there is no controversy over the correct dosages. And we have the correct dosages available. So I'll get to that later. So hopefully you understand by now that you should only use dewormers when absolutely necessary. And a lot of people ask me, like, well, what's the best dewormer? Because I want to use the best dewormer. No, you don't. You want to start with the weakest dewormer and continue to use it until it no longer works. And if you use them correctly, it will never stop working, because you shouldn't be overusing it. And we're going to talk about how to do that. You basically use management to prevent your problems. And number one on that is pasture rotation. Like I said, you don't want them to graze grass that is less than 6 inches, because the larvae are going to be on the lower 4 inches of the grass. Larvae can't crawl, and so that's why they're on the bottom part of the grass. If the grass is wet, and that's why number 2 here says, don't let them graze wet grass. If the grass is wet, the larvae can float up on the grass, but they really don't float much higher than about 4 inches. So lots of researchers have checked lots of grass and have said that the larva is on the lower 4 inches. So I don't want to let my goats graze less than 6 inches. And another thing that you can do is you can mix species. You can either mix them together, or you can have a leader follower program. So sheep and goats do share the same parasites. However, cows have different parasites, horses have different parasites, pigs have different parasites, chickens have different parasites. They all have different parasites. So you can graze and the thing too is that, like, goats and cows are going to eat different things. Because remember I said goats are browsers, cows are grazers. So if you put goats and cows in the pasture together, the cows are going to go around and eat all the grass, and the goats are going to go around and eat the floribunda roses and the weeds that the cows don't like and all that kind of stuff. And if the goats consume the cow worm larva, they will digest it. And if the cows consume the goat worm larva, they will digest it. So I always tell people this is like, Mars is a planet and Earth is a planet, but we can't live on Mars. And it's the same thing. Goat worms cannot live inside a cow or a pig or a horse, and horse worms cannot live inside of a goat. This is not the case with sheep and goats. So they do share worms. They do both get barber pole worm, and llamas. So goats, sheep, and camelids, llamas and alpacas all get barber pole worm. So that gets tricky, and I'm not going to go off on that tangent now. So if you can provide browse, that is one of the most amazing things. So if you've got 30 acres of nothing but trees, great. You probably don't need to do pasture rotation. If there's no grass in there, if your goats are just going to be going in there and just on their hind legs all day long, eating leaves out of the trees and eating bushes, there is no worm larva there. So you don't need to worry. They're not going to have a problem. I did a podcast with a goat owner who had goats on a forested piece of land initially. And she had no worm problems, and she was doing everything wrong. Her vet was coming once a year and giving all of her goats a dose of dewormer, the exact same dewormer every year, once a year, giving it to all of them. And, this woman never had any worm problems. She thought she was doing the best thing ever with her goats, and that she was just the greatest goat owner. She had goats for like 5 years, didn't have a single parasite problem. And then she moved to a new farm that did not have woods. It was nothing but pasture. And within months, goats were dying, and she did not understand why. And so you really need to understand the science behind it. So when you see people online telling you like, oh, I do XYZ, and you're like, I've heard that that's not a good idea. There's some other, if they don't have worm problems, there is some reason that they don't have worm problems. They're just not aware of, maybe they're in Arizona. And so just by definition, their goats are on a dry lot. Or maybe if they're in Tennessee, they have acres of Lespedeza and they don't know it. Because Lespedeza is actually a natural dewormer. And if your goats are grazing on that every day, you're not going to have worm problems or coccidia problems. Lespedeza is amazing. If you live in an area where you can grow Lespedeza, that stuff is amazing. It's the only thing out there that kills both worms and coccidia, which is pretty wild. So if you can't do pasture rotation, you don't have a forest, you can do a dry lot. Because, and this is where like, it's so important to know the science. I always tell people, don't do what somebody says they do, because if they don't know why they're doing it, they're probably going to mislead you. Goats need grass to get infected with worm larvae. So if there is no grass, then it's going to be very minimal. Assuming, of course, that you're not just throwing hay on the ground. If you're throwing hay on the ground and goats are pooping on it and then they're eating it, that's another story. But if you've got a legit dry lot, and by dry lot, I really mean there's nothing growing in there. Sometimes people tell me they have a dry lot, and I always ask for pictures when I work with people. They're like, oh, I have a dry lot. And they send me pictures and it's half covered with grass. You've got these big clumps of grass everywhere. And it's like, well, I bet those clumps of grass have a lot of goat poop in them, which means that there's a lot of worm larvae in there. So you don't really have a dry lot. So the next thing is breeding for resistance. And that is what I mentioned earlier. Like if you wanted to do that, that would be a case of where you needed to do fecals and make the decision like, okay, well, this goat does not have great resistance, so they're no longer going to be a part of my breeding program. One of the things I do is that I keep a lot of bucks out of my favorite does. So for me to keep a buck, it has to be one of my best milk producers, and he has to be good He has to have great parasite resistance. And I actually do not do fecals. I learned how to do fecals 20 years ago. I don't think I've done one in more than 10 years. But the way that I choose my bucks is that, first of all, it's based on the mom. If the mom is one of my best milkers, and then he hangs out on my farm for like a year. And if he needs to be dewormed, he gets castrated and sold as a pet. And that's how I do it. So it's like, you know what? You are out there in a pasture with 7 or 8 other bucks. Nobody else needed a dewormer, but you did. So that tells me you have the worst resistance of anybody in that pen. And I don't want to keep you in my breeding program because I don't want you having babies that would mean that they need a dewormer within, the first year of their life. So the next thing is that depending on where you live, if you have a worm problem already, you might want to do seasonal birthing based upon that. So back when we had complete dewormer resistance, what we did, because basically giving birth is stressful for a goat. And so she might have a problem with worms after giving birth. And so if my goats, so way back, we did a lot of birthing in January and February because in Illinois in January and February, the ground is covered with snow. Everything is frozen. It's below freezing. Barber pole worm does not start hatching unless your temperatures are over 50 degrees. So there's zero risk of infection for goats in Illinois in a normal winter when it's normally, as cold as it normally is. And we have all the snow and all that kind of stuff. And so that was one of the things we did. I don't do that anymore because I don't have to. I don't know who would want to have because if we had kittings that were below zero. I think the coldest one we ever had was 15 or 16 degrees below zero. And I don't want to do that again. And we don't have to. So, because we got everything dialed in. And then the last thing listed there are tannin plants. And so that is the category of Sericea lespedeza. Sericea lespedeza is by far the one that has been more studied than anything. But there's also other plants like chicory and some other ones that are good. But this is not like you can't just give your goats, a tablespoon of these things. It is not magic. Like they literally need to be out there grazing it all day long, every day, to really get the best results. So believe it or not, I have barely scratched the surface here. Our parasites in goat course is 7 hours of training that gets more into all of the science behind this. And it includes the complete FAMACHA training, which is not just teaching you how to pull down the eyelid on your goat, but because being able to check your eyelids is worthless if you don't know how to use the dewormers. I wish they changed the name of it to something else, but it was created by the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control, which has been around for about 20 years. And I have been a certified FAMACHA instructor now for almost 4 years. And the course also includes interviews with parasite researchers. And so you get all of the training for FAMACHA, the videos with other parasite professionals. And then there's discussion boards with each lesson where you can ask questions. And I get notifications immediately and I respond to all of those. So that's where if you have questions about rotational grazing, I got a lot of questions for you about your land and all that kind of stuff so that we can figure out what's going to work in your particular situation. And the Parasites in Goats course is one of 6 courses in our Goats 365 membership. Those 6 courses add up to 40 hours of training. And this is all similar to what I teach in my University of Massachusetts class on raising goats. It's like the same information. And right now I've got a bonus because it's spring. And if you don't have parasite problems right now, they could just be right around the corner because remember I said barber pole worms start to hatch when the temperatures go above 50 degrees. So people tend to have a lot of parasite problems in the spring and the summer, which is why every year I do this webinar or a webinar like this, not this one exactly, but every spring I do a parasite webinar to try and get this information out to people so that they can avoid problems in the first place. And so if you sign up for Goats 365 membership, we're going to do a special live Q&A a week from Thursday, April 30th at 7 p.m. Central Time, so that you can get started. Like if you have any specific questions that we need to talk through, we can do that. You can also ask questions in the course, like in the discussion board. If it's a quick question, like, can I give valbazin to nursing does? I would answer and say, yes, you can give any dewormer to a nursing doe. Don't give valbazin to a goat in the first couple months of pregnancy, though. But if you've got a more extensive question, like especially, I'm going to do a special pasture management training. I started doing this a couple years ago when I realized that most people who tell me that they can't do rotational grazing don't understand how you're supposed to do it. They think that they need lots and lots and lots of acres, and they need to spend thousands of dollars on fencing, and that's not how it works at all. You use portable electric netting, and you put them in an area that you think, this looks like they can eat all of this grass in about 5 days. That's where you need to put them. So, I see people with like 3 goats and think that they need an acre for each pasture. And it's like, no. There was someone that I sold, she bought 4 goats for me, and she used 4 16 by 16 livestock panels to make a pen for them. And she moved that every day or every other day, kind of depending on how fast the grass grew. And did not have worm problems. In fact, she had fat goats because she moved them every day or two. And because that was, about how long it would take them to eat the grass. And they only had like 2 acres, which is why she had the 4x4, or sorry, the 16 by 16 pen. That was for 4 Nigerians. So if you had a couple of standard size goats, you could do that too. Otherwise, you use like electronet. But I'm going too far with that. So that's why I have a whole night that's going to be set. It will be in May at some time because I'm having eye surgery at the end of May. So the pasture management training will be in May sometime. The other thing is, if you join Goats 365 at the premium level, we have meetings 3 times a month, and pasture management, rotational grazing and stuff is one of the many things that we talk about in those meetings. So that's another option. But the bonuses I have this month are this week. If you want to be a monthly member, it's 50% off your first month. And if you want to be an annual member, you will get a free 60-minute private consultation, which is normally $150. And that's not one of those things people make up. Like, people really do consultations because they're like, I don't have time for a class. I just want to talk to you, and you need to tell me what to do. And so they do that. The portable electric netting, I love this stuff from Premier One, and I use the Sheep and Goat Electronet. And again, oh my gosh, I could totally go off on all of that. Don't get the poultry netting for goats. Goats 365 membership, a month is $19 or $29 if you want to do monthly, and then the annual is either $187 or $287. The difference between basic and premium, the big difference is that in premium we do at least 3 Zoom calls a month. So we do a Monday night, a Tuesday night, and a Tuesday morning. And then there's almost every month we have some kind of an additional training. Like we're going to have this extra training for this extra parasite training on the 30th. And we've already had our 3 meetings. And next month, we're going to have the pasture training. So in some months, some of the other things we do is like talking about how to sell your baby goats or sell your goat products and stuff. And the sign up is, you can go to goats365.com. Oh, and Amy actually also just shared a link. If you go up about 4 or 5 comments, there you go. She did it again. So that should have the half off coupon already attached. So you don't need a coupon code or anything if you do the monthly. And if you do the annual membership, I'll send you an email with a link to my private calendar, and you get to pick the time that works for you. So there's plenty of stuff on there during the week. And if you really need a weekend, I can do that if you need it. And the 60-minute private consultation is, a lot of people love that because, first of all, we talk for the whole hour, but it also really helps them get started, in terms of like, what do I need to work on now? What is my herd like? And it allows me to ask you a bunch of questions about your goats and learn about you, because the answer for everything is it depends. So yes, we are getting very close, although it depends on how many questions that we have. So and like I said, there will be a replay. We will send you a link to the replay. So if you knew that you had to leave an hour and 22 minutes afterwards, you can just jump ahead to that to see what you missed. So this is just what you're going to be able to do with what you learn in the parasite course. You'll understand why you do or don't have parasite problems on your farm or with specific goats. This is really important because every summer I get contacted by people who tell me, like, I lived in California or Utah or Arizona for 10 years. I never lost a goat to worms. And I've been in North Carolina or Georgia or Florida for 4 months and I've already lost 3 goats. I don't understand what's wrong. I haven't changed anything. Well, that's what's wrong. They didn't know that they had no worm problems out west in the desert because they were in the desert. And so they didn't know any of the science behind it. And so once they got to the East Coast, which is covered with grass and lots of rain, and it is barber pole heaven, then they have problems. And that's not unusual. So you're also going to learn how to use the dewormers only when you need them. You'll know what the correct dewormer dosages are for goats. If you have any questions, we've got them listed, but if you have any questions, we can answer them for you. You'll know what else to do after you give a dewormer to help that goat recover. Some of those $150 consultations I do are for people who have a goat that's been down for a week or two. And, it's just the saddest thing in the world. I have been emailed by people saying, should I just put my goat down? Because he hasn't stood for like a week or two and the vet's been out here and it's like, oh my gosh, no, you don't need to put your goat down. I had a goat who could not stand for 3 weeks and we got him back on the right track. So goats have a fabulous will to live. They are amazing animals, but we have to know what to do. If you give them a dewormer and put them back out there and make them eat from their toilet, then you're just reinfecting them. And that's like one of the biggest problems. If you have a goat that has white eyelids, you need to put it in the barn. So like it gets treated with that dewormer keeps working, and you're able to kill the worms and get them recovered. They gain back their weight. Their eyelids pink up again. They're pooping pebbles again. And that's because you've eliminated the possibility of them getting reinfected. You'll be able to create a rotational grazing system that works with the number of goats you have and your property. So that's why it's hard. People are like, oh, how often do you move them? Well, the short technical answer is every 5 days. But then the question is, well, how many pastures do you need? And how soon can they go back to pasture A? And that's when it starts to get complicated, because there's a lot of it depends there. It depends on how much rain you're having and all that kind of stuff. And so basically, and what you need to do is become the expert on your goats, your worms, and your farm, because it is going to be very different than it is for somebody else. It could be, it's definitely different for somebody in Arizona than it is for somebody in Georgia, but it could also be different for somebody who lives down the road from you. I mean, you could have some guy down there going, I've had goats for 20 years. They've never had a worm problem. Maybe his fields are covered with Sericea lespedeza and he doesn't know it. So that's why it's important to understand like all of this stuff. So you can manage parasites successfully on your farm. My goats are not special. They were dying over 15 years ago. And we finally figured out, I read the research, I followed the recommendations. I'm working with the same genetics that I've had since 2002 to 2005, when my goats were dying from worms. And the reason I say that is because I have not bought a doe since 2005. Every single doe on my farm was born on my farm. And so is her mother and grandmother and great-grandmother and so on. We've got 7 or 8 generations of some lines on our farm. I just bring in new bucks every now and then to keep the genetics fresh. And that is my challenge, is bringing in bucks that have the good genetics for parasite resistance and resilience. So the key to success is knowledge. It is not any particular dewormer, because all dewormers fail at some point, if they work at all. There's a lot of stuff people say out there work, like Shackley Basic Age. That is not even, like, there's just nothing about that works. And I tried it and it didn't work. So there was no fecal reduction whatsoever. And it didn't help the goats. So now I am going to get to questions. I am going to page back up here. Because I starred some of the first questions that I said I was going to skip. Let's see. So Kathy said, how often should the goats be rotated to a different pasture? So technically the answer to that is no longer than 5 days. But that can vary. So if you're having a lot of rain, then, well, because this really gets tricky in terms of when they need to come back. So some people think they can have 2 or 3 pastures and rotate the goats back and forth between those 2 pastures. And the reality is that your goats need to be off of grass for a minimum of 6 weeks. Really, 8 weeks is better. And the reality is, if you're having a lot of rain, the larva can live for many months. The way that larvae die on the pasture is by dehydration. So back in 2012, we had a drought and all of our pastures turned brown. We did not have a single drop of rain for over 3 months. And I had the fattest, healthiest goats of the whole 24 years that we have had goats, because the goats were pooping out their worm eggs and they were baking in those black fecal pellets in the 90-degree sun with no rain for 3 months. So, and I've asked multiple researchers, like, so how long will goats live on pasture if you're getting a lot of rain? And everybody just goes, months. Like, they just shake their head, like, months. So that's the problem. And so then you have to look at why. You have to look at, like, okay, well, how tall is the grass? If the grass is like 1.5 feet tall, then even though there's still live worm larvae down there that's viable because it's been raining a lot, and they haven't dehydrated in the last couple months. But if the grass is like 1.5 feet tall, the goats can eat that and not get down to the larva. And I always tell people when it comes to understanding that, so every now and then I hear somebody talk about a pasture stick, and that is like a special stick that you have that you take out into your pasture that's exactly the length that you want your grass to be for whatever purpose. So this is my pasture stick. It is exactly 6 inches from the tip of my middle finger down to my wrist. So I walk out into the middle of a pasture and I put my hand down, and I want the grass to come all the way up to my wrist. If the grass, if I'm in several places and the grass does not come up to my wrist, then it's time to move the goats. So the answer about how often should goats be rotated is really complex. And then Marianne said, will the worms get resistant to natural dewormers like wormwood, pumpkin seed, etc.? That question is honestly kind of irrelevant because those things don't really kill many worms. Back when we had complete dewormer resistance, I literally tried everything. And there were 3 very popular herbalists back then. I think they're still all out there selling their blends, and they told you to give them a tablespoon once a week. And we did that, and it did not work. I had a buck die from worms when I was using it. And I was giving him twice as much, I was giving him 2 tablespoons every day. Actually, he couldn't stand. I was giving him 2 tablespoons of this mint blend every day. And I was doing before, and I was doing multiple fecals. There was never a change in any of those fecals. The other thing is, we've had a lot of interns over the years. Some of them were pre-vet students. One year, it was pretty cool because I hate doing fecals. I told y'all I haven't done one, and I don't think I've done one in 10 years. We had an intern once who was a pre-vet student, who is a vet now. She was a pre-vet student, and she loved doing fecals. She had actually worked in a vet's office the previous summer, and she wanted to do fecals. And so what I learned was that a lot of wormwood, and this is the thing, because I asked Dr. Burke. Dr. Joan Burke is someone who has done, I don't know, probably hundreds of studies on worms at this point in sheep and goats, because she's an expert in sheep and goats. And I asked her, I'm like, so why do you think that these things don't really work? And she said, well, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, one of them is that it's just the dosage isn't high enough. So I played around with wormwood. And she said the other reason is because when you're dealing with just a natural product, the strength of it is going to vary from one year to the next based upon growing conditions, so like depending on how much rain they got, what the weather was like, some is going to have more of that active ingredient than others. And so that's the thing about like modern medications. And when they take something out, they take a specific substance out of a natural thing. Like willow bark has the same thing in it that's in aspirin. But the amount of that in willow bark is going to vary from like one tree to the next. Whereas when they make aspirin, they are standardizing it. And so she said, there's no standardization. Mother Nature has no standardization process. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm going to grow my own wormwood and see what happens. So I grew my own wormwood, which, by the way, if you want to do this, just let me tell you, wormwood is more invasive than mint. Okay. It took over. I put it in my herb garden. It completely took over. It pushed out my mint. I was completely blown away because I thought mint was like the most invasive thing in the world. I was wrong. Wormwood is more invasive. And so anyway, I'm like, all right, I'm going to grow my own wormwood. And so when that pre-vet student was at our place and she wanted to do fecals, I was like, cool. So let's see what we can do here. So I offered so there was a goat that had a worm problem. I measured out an ounce of wormwood in a big bowl. And let me tell you, an ounce of wormwood is like this much because it's very lightweight. Okay, so And remember, like most of these people who sell these herbal things are selling you, like telling you to give them a tablespoon, right? And so I'm like, all right, let's just let's see what you want. Like in nature, you would just be able to eat what you wanted. So I filled up this bowl and I weighed it. So like this big bowl, it was an ounce of wormwood in it. I let her eat as much as she wanted. And then I weighed it to see what was left. There was half an ounce left. So she ate half an ounce of wormwood, which was about 2 cups. It was a lot. And the fecal egg reduction was 50%. That's it. So it helped her, but it would not help a goat that was severely parasitized. So I basically, if I had just been looking at her, I'd have been like, oh my gosh, that wormwood works so great. Like, her milk supply went back up. She regained her body condition. Her eyelids look better. Everything's great. Like wormwood is amazing. But because we had that fecal, I'm like, whoa, it only killed 50% of the worms. But that's all it needed to kill for her to feel better. Now, if she had had white eyelids and it only killed 50% of the worms, she probably would have died, because a 50% reduction for a goat that is that anemic is not going to help them. So the bottom line is with these plants and stuff is that, so these things, giving animals, like giving them pumpkin seeds every fall, that just goes back to the annual deworming thing, like instead of giving them ivermectin in the fall, you're giving them pumpkin seeds. And well, what if they get worms in April or June, So anyway, but the pumpkin seeds I haven't done before and after fecals on pumpkin seeds, but I used to know somebody, once I learned about FAMACHA, none of my Shetland sheep ever got a dewormer ever again because they didn't need it. But I knew this lady who's like, oh, my sheep never have worms because I give them pumpkins every fall. And she would post all these pictures of her sheep with orange lips every fall, which is really cute pictures. But, she was absolutely convinced that her annual fall pumpkin feeding was what was keeping her sheep parasite-free. And the reality is Shetland sheep are just very parasite resistant. They really don't have a problem with worms. They're amazing. My goats were dying from worms and my Shetland sheep were walking around fat and happy. So the next one, Joan said, I've read that you have to deworm with 2 separate classes of dewormers. You don't have to. If you have any kind of problems with dewormer resistance, you need to, yes. And that's what I did actually. So this is where like there are no rules that are like engraved in stone. The answer is always, it depends. When I had goats dying, like if you have goats dying from worms, then you probably actually need to use 3 classes of dewormer. And that's what I was doing. We were all the way up to 3 classes of dewormers before that, even that no longer worked. So you might need to use 3 classes. I do not like the idea of using more than 1 class of dewormers if you don't have a problem, because, and this is the thing, like there was this parasitologist who like 10 years ago wrote this article saying the time for combination dewormers is now. And the thing is, because they work with people who have serious problems with dewormer resistance. And if you have serious problems with dewormer resistance, that may be your only answer other than just sitting there and watching your goats die. So saying that you have to deworm with 2 classes of dewormers is, you might have to, but you might also need to use 3 if you don't have serious problems. If you just have a goat, I mean, like there is no reason for you to go out and buy, Safeguard and ivermectin. If you've never treated your goats for worms, you've never used a dewormer on your farm, and now you have a goat that has a worm problem, just use Safeguard. That'll probably take care of it. Why would you want to spend all of that extra money and expose all of the worms in that goat to a second dewormer if you don't have to? So I don't like to use drugs that I don't need. It's kind of like if you have an infection that penicillin will cure, why would you use 2 or 3 different antibiotics? William asked about meningeal worm. Yes, I probably have more experience with meningeal worm than most vets that you will ever meet, because we used to have llamas, and the meningeal worms ultimately killed all of my llamas, and 3 of my goats got meningeal worm. 0 sheep have gotten it. So the interesting thing about meningeal worm, I assume you're asking this because you've had a problem. The interesting thing about meningeal worm is that this is really very genetically linked. It's a worm that's naturally found in deer. And so in sheep, goats, and camelids, it is a aberrant, they're an aberrant host. And so they shouldn't be able to infect them. Remember earlier I said that, like, if your goat eats cow worms, it's going to digest them. And if a cow eats goat worms, it'll digest them, and so on. Because most worms are species specific. So is meningeal worm. And so for most animals, if most animals consume the meningeal worm larva, most sheep, goats, I'm not going to say camelids, most sheep and goats are going to just digest them. They're not going to have a problem. Some definitely do. I have seen, there are some farms who've lost like a dozen sheep. I have had 0 sheep get meningeal worm. Like I said, I raised Shetlands for about 12 years, never had one get meningeal worm. I've had Katahdins for about 12 years, never had a single one get meningeal worm. On the flip side, I lost all of my llamas to meningeal worm, and I've had 3 goats get meningeal worm. 2 of them were full sisters. So if everybody's out there, browsing on all the same stuff, and 2 full sisters get meningeal worm, that sure sounds like there's a genetic issue with them not being immune to it. So my assumption is that most of my goats are immune to meningeal worm, because we have white-tailed deer going through our property all the time. So, Cindy said, ivermectin is safe for humans. Is the danger of injectable ivermectin because the ivermectin will come through the milk and humans will consume some ivermectin? If you want to consume dewormer, I mean, one of the reasons that I have my farm is because I want all natural food. You could say the same thing about penicillin. Penicillin is safe for humans. So this is a kind of a weird question. It's like, do you want to consume drug residues? I don't. And the thing here is, and this is why this was funny. Slaughterhouses test for antibiotic residue because they don't want meat getting into the food supply that has antibiotic residues in it, because they're trying to reduce or completely eliminate antibiotic resistance. So if you injected your goat with ivermectin and then you're drinking their milk for 2 months and then you needed a dewormer for some reason, the ivermectin might not work. Probably wouldn't work, because you've been exposing all of your parasites to this low dose of ivermectin for the last 2 months, or 3 months if it's Sidectin. Closer to 3. It's some odd number between 2 and 3 months for Sidectin. But anyway, so now it wouldn't work for you. And in fact, a vet professor actually told me the only reason they don't check for dewormer residue at slaughterhouses is because most humans in this country don't need dewormers. So we're not worried about dewormer resistance in humans. But I know there are people online who say that we all have parasites and should be taking ivermectin regularly. So that's a whole nother story, but that's the problem with that. Somebody said, what about prohibit? I'm not sure what the question is about prohibit. Prohibit is levamisole. Prohibit is levamisole. You should never, ever use that until nothing else works. It is the strongest dewormer out there. And that is basically your ace. Like you hold that back and you do not use it until nothing else works. Because if you get to the point where levamisole doesn't work, then you got nothing. Kathy said, for a blood transfusion, is that true for crossbreeds? It's true for all goats. In fact, I did the coolest podcast interview with a vet from Wisconsin who actually used cow blood to transfuse into goats, and they survived. So that's a podcast that I have. So yeah, it doesn't matter what breed your goat is. There are, like I think maybe you're asking like, if you've got a La Mancha, can it give blood to a Nigerian? And the answer is yes. Let's see. These are some of the, and this is, okay, now I'm coming to the questions that I started answering during the live webinar, during the presentation. Okay. So Carrie was the person who said, how do you know which droppings belong to which goat? Oh, now I understand your question. Okay, got it. So this is where, you know what, if somebody says they're doing some crazy thing, like they're deworming their goats with lye, for example, if they say that and then they say that they've got fecals with 0 worms on them, it's because, okay, so the guy who made that famous said that his daughter went out and scraped up poop off of their, which they have a dry lot. You can see it in his video. So anyway, picked up poop and took it in, and there were 0 worms. Well, that's because all of the worms already hatched. You have to have fresh poop. So that means you got to stand there and wait for the goat to poop. It's actually not that hard if you start to learn your goats' patterns. Like I know my goats usually take a nap in the afternoon around 1 or 2 o'clock. And so if I go out there, when I go out there in the afternoon and say, hi, goaties, they get up and they start eating. And as soon as they get up from their nap and start eating, they start pooping. So that is a great time to have a little paper cup and just go over there and catch the poop. And so that is how you know what goat it came from. So your poop always needs to be fresh, because if it's not fresh, then the eggs hatch. The eggs hatch very quickly. So so I kind of answered this already, I think. Controversy over dosage. There is no controversy on the dosage. There is a lot of old information and people just don't know it's old. So, you know, when somebody tells me they treated their goat for worms, I asked always, my first question then is going to be, what did you treat with? How much did you give them? And almost, I hate to say this, but the majority of the time, the vets are just using the sheep dosage. And that's, for most dewormers, that's half of what they should have. So for Safeguard, Valbazen, ivermectin, Sidectin, a goat should have twice the sheep dosage for those 4. And a lot of vets don't know that because they're not doing continuing education on goats. And so they don't realize that all of the research that's been done in the last 15 to 20 years says that goats need twice as much of those dewormers as a sheep does. And for levamisole, it only should be 1.5, because this is another reason you don't use levamisole unless you absolutely have to, because it is the strongest. It also has the lowest margin of error. And so you should only give them 1.5 times the dosage of levamisole. And I know a vet professor who said that someone contacted him one time. They had killed several of their sheep because they gave them 4 times as much levamisole as what the label said. So it's really important that you have the right dosage. So, Somebody said it's hard to get valbazen, so what can you use instead? So the information that we give people for deworming is from the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control. They are by far, like, they are the group of veterinary researchers in the United States who have been doing the research for over 20 years now on what dewormers goats need, how much, and all that kind of stuff. And there are 6 dewormers listed on there. So I don't even tell people. So first of all, you can't use valbazen during the first 2 months of pregnancy. I don't even usually tell people to use valbazen unless Safeguard is not working. So Safeguard and valbazen are both white dewormers. They are in the same class. Ivermectin and cydectin are clear dewormers. They're in the second class. All of those mectins are the same. So there's also aprinomectin, which is sold as Eprinex Poron for cattle in the US. It is sold for goats in the EU and Ireland, but in the US, it's only sold for cattle. So all of the mectins, cydectin, moxidectin, ivermectin, aprinomectin, all of those are available for goats. And I always tell people to start with, so either start with Safeguard as your white dewormer or start with ivermectin as your clear dewormer. And again, all of those are used at twice the sheep dosage. So you want to get the sheep drench, and that is what you would give to your goats at twice the sheep dosage. So somebody had a goat that had barber pole, and they did triple dewormers, a blood transfusion, and he survived. His daughter had symptoms of worms and also came back with barber pole. She was given a dual dewormer and saw no improvement. Oh, there's more. Okay, so it doesn't all show up on my screen. She was given a dual dewormer. Oh, nope, that's it. That's all he wrote. Okay. All right. So I don't think there's a question in there. The other stuff, this is the kind of thing that a lot of times I wind up doing those private consultations for, is somebody in a situation like this. And so the other thing is that, like, you don't treat a goat like this and just stick them back out there on the pasture, because you're like, oh yeah, I know you're sick, but I want you to go back out there and keep eating those worm larvae that got you sick in the first place, because they're going to be consuming the worm larvae fast enough. It's going to be a problem. So they need to be kept in the barn. They need a high protein diet, so that they can rebuild muscle and red blood cells and all that kind of stuff. So it's so much more. This is not just take 2 aspirin and call me in the morning. There is a lot here, like, this is the kind of thing I usually spend an hour with somebody going through, like, everything about their farm setup and what they're feeding the goats and what the minerals are and everything, because it's all related. And that's why we put everything together in Goats 365, because many times if somebody has a parasite problem, they also have some nutritional issues that they need to deal with and that they need to improve upon. And so then I can point them to the parts of the nutrition course that can be helpful to them. Here's the rest of the thing before. So the daughter did not survive. And then his question is, should each individual class be used separately before a combination is used? Yes. Yeah. If this is, if this is the first time that you ever use dewormers on your goats, you absolutely should not have started with a triple dewormer. I bet you had the wrong dosages. If you had the wrong dosages, there's a good chance they're not going to survive if they've got a lot of worms. Yeah, it's so Barbara said she had 3 different vets tell her 3 different dosages. I'm sad to say, I know, I hear that all the time. And then someone asked, does feeding help keep worm count down? Um, oh, here we go. I'm like, I don't understand. Okay. Oops. 2 pet goats get free choice hay and graze pasture. Would hay be a healthier choice? No, there's nothing wrong with grazing pasture as long as you're not keeping them on the same place all the time. So if you can rotate, and if you only have 2 pet goats, that's really easy in terms of rotating. But this is the kind of thing where it would be easier if we were actually talking and I could ask you more questions and all that kind of stuff. But there's no way that I would say hay is a healthier choice because fresh pasture is very healthy because usually it's got weeds in it if they can browse and consume, browse and weeds have way more minerals than grass. So, and hay is generally going to be grass. And so it's actually pasture is much better for goats than hay. But if you have a worm problem, and you need to put your goats in the barn, then of course you give them hay. So, and then Cheryl says, do you treat stalls if you have a parasite problem with 1 or 2 goats? Do you separate the goats from the herd? Okay, I'm not sure if you mean, do you treat the stall as in, do you spray the stall with some chemical or something? If that's the question, no. If your goats had lice or mites, the answer would be yes, because lice and mites are on the outside of your goat and in your bedding and the walls of your barn and everywhere. So if your goats have external parasites, then you need to treat the stall in the barn. But for internal parasites, no, you don't, because the internal parasites are spread through the grass on the pasture. And do you separate the goats from the herd? It depends on how bad they are. If their eyelids are white, absolutely they need to be in the barn, and that is for them. I get the feeling maybe you're asking here because you're worried about the goats, the goat making the others sick, and that doesn't happen. It's all about consuming the grass with the larva on it. That's how the goats get sick. So they can't give each other worms just by being together in a stall. So it's not really about separating a goat from the herd. It's about taking the goat off of pasture so that you can feed them individually and give them the extra protein and calcium that they need to rebuild muscle and red blood cells and all that kind of stuff. So someone asked about biowerma. Biowerma it works. It is a great option if you truly cannot do rotational grazing, which, like I said, most people can. I would say 90% of the people who come to me thinking that they can't do rotational grazing actually can. It's just that they did not understand what rotational grazing actually meant. Biowerma is very expensive, but it absolutely works. In fact, zoos use it. Like I was talking to somebody at Premier One couple years ago, and they were talking about running low on it, and they were not expecting zoos to want it, but like apparently it even works on the worms that giraffes get. And if you just think about what a lot of zoo enclosures look like, they've got these animals in a small area. And so, which is just great if you're a worm. Like, it's a great way for a worm to find a home inside of a goat's tummy. So dry lot too would be your other option. So rotational grazing, putting your goats in a forest, putting your goats on a dry lot. Biowerma is just an alternative for people who can't do any of those things. But if you I see a lot of people putting their goats on a dry lot and giving them biowerma, and you shouldn't need to do that. If it is truly a legitimate dry lot, you should not, like, you're wasting your money on the biowerma. Yeah, that's one of the things a lot of people think like, oh, I don't know if I can afford Goats 365. But the reality is most people wind up not buying stuff that they were buying, like not buying bioworma, not buying multiple dewormers, not buying as many dewormers because now they know like, oh, I shouldn't be using this on all my goats. And then let's see. All right, that's it. It looks like I am to the end of the questions. So last chance here for asking questions. So I always stick around until the end in case people have questions. And if you join us in Goats 365 and we have meetings, the meetings are usually 1 to 2 hours long. I stick around as long as anybody has questions. I am not one of those people who's like, oh, time's up, bye. Because goats, like if you've got goat questions, you probably need an answer fairly soon. So, well, George says, I had a lamb born about 3 weeks ago. When should I deworm for the first time? Hopefully never. So I think you came in late, but so I would suggest going back to the beginning. We're at the end here. And so I would suggest going back to the beginning. You should never really need to deworm them. Most of the goats on my farm now have never had a dewormer. And 20 years ago, I had goats dying from worms. And so the goal is that they never need one. But it's all about management. So it's not just like, because I thought when I got goats and sheep and all the things, I thought, oh, I'm just going to stick them out there on the pasture and they'll be fine. And I had goats dying in a couple years, but the sheep and the cows were fine. So you really should not need to deworm, but it's all about management. You've got to make sure you get your management right. And then Carrie, I love this question. I'm so glad you asked this question. So is there anything you can spray in the pasture to kill the parasites? No, there's not. This is one of the things that they thought like, oh, this is one of the things they long time ago, like before I even came along, like when I got started 24 years ago, they already knew this does not work. In fact, one of the things that they tried was burning pasture. They thought that if we burn the pasture, that we can burn up all of the larvae and that'll take care of it, or the coccidia, and it doesn't. So it's because it's too fast. Pasture burns really, because grass is just like, there's next to nothing to it, and so it just burns too fast, and the larva is too low, or the eggs are too low, so it doesn't hurt them at all. There's nothing you can spray in the pasture. Because the thing is, and people are like, well, can I sprinkle DE out there? DE is a physical dewormer. You would have to physically manage to cover every single, like it's only going to kill the larva that it is attached to. So like you would have to get the DE on every single piece of larva. So you would use an insane amount of DE and it would look like it just snowed on your pasture because the larva is microscopic. So if you're in the course, you can see, I actually have pictures in the course of what a drop of grass looks like under a microscope with tons of larvae in it. Like a single drop of water has a lot of worm larvae in it. And it's being protected by that drop of water. So stuff's not gonna get to it. George says, I understand what you're saying, but currently I don't have fences set up to do the rotation. So it's still, please go back and watch this from the beginning. You don't have to watch 2 hours because I've been answering questions for quite a while now. But I talk about it from the beginning. You need to keep an eye on the, like if they're in a really big area, then if they're in a really big area, it's possible that, depending on what's growing there, like depending on where you're at, like if you're in Arizona, you're fine. You're not going to have any problems. There's so many different, it depends. So, depending on where you're at, how much rain you get, whether you have grass in your pasture, whether what you've got, it totally depends. And that's the stuff I talk about like in the first hour and 20 minutes or so of this webinar. Barbara said, if a goat poops in its water, will those worms hatch out? Nope. They can't. They have to have oxygen. They need to be on the pasture. That's why they do not hatch inside the goat, because they're like living in a watery environment. So, somebody said it takes 6 generations to naturally adapt to the new environment, and natural immunity builds over time. I don't know. I haven't heard that before, but that is one of those broad sweeping generalization kind of things that it doesn't actually, I would love to see like where that got pulled from, because there is way more to it than just that one sentence. I had goats in one generation. My goats adapted. It was like basically all the goats that didn't die from worms were very resistant or resilient. And it's kind of like the worms in the goats. Like if the dewormer doesn't kill the worms, then they're going to be very resistant to the dewormer. So I'm not sure where, like if there's a question here, but I wouldn't go, oh, well, I'm just going to have to watch goats die for 6 generations and then they'll be fine, because that's not true. It's all about the management. Donna says, if after a few days you see no improvement, do you retreat, or what else do you do? No, you don't. So it depends. If you're talking about a goat with white eyelids, they might need to have a blood transfusion. Okay. So there's that. Once you treat your goat, you might need to take it off pasture. It's probably, depending on how bad it is, depending on how bad it is, you might need to put them in the barn. I should not be reading more questions that are popping up. Everybody's asking questions now. Okay, I've got to concentrate on this one. No, there's a whole list. So like basically you need to assess the goat when you treat them, and depending upon their condition, how bad it is, you may choose to let them stay on pasture. If they are not, like if their eyelids are white or very, very pale pink, and their body condition is bad and they're pooping logs or got diarrhea, if they have bottle jaw, for sure, you need to put them in the barn and keep them in there. You need to give them a high protein diet, and basically that kind of stuff. So let's see. The next question. Following every goat pasture rotation with cattle to clean up would be very beneficial. Yes, it would. In fact, remember I said we had Irish Dexter cattle for about 12 years. I did not like the cattle, okay? There are lots of reasons I do not like cattle. One is they attract flies, which goats do not attract nearly as many flies as the cows do, but because the cows have cow patties. And I hate the cow patties. Like that's just so gross. Like you got to watch where you're walking in the pasture and everything. However, so I really am not a fan of cattle. I don't even like beef hardly at all. But the reason we kept cows for 12 years is because I knew that they really helped us get rid of our worm problem. I viewed the cows and the pigs and the horses, I viewed all of them as basically my pasture hoovers. After the goats, they were to go out there and finish off the grass and consume all of the goat larvae and digest it to help my goats. And so it was all about the goats. Like, that's the whole reason that we had horses and cows and pigs for as long as we did. And now all we have is sheep, goats, and chickens. So Frank said that he heard that about 6 generations from Fred Provenza. That's cool. I know Fred, and I've interviewed him on the podcast. I don't know if you have seen or heard the podcast on nutritional wisdom. So I know there is a lot more to that. I know there's a lot more to that than just that one sentence. But so I'm not sure how it fits into the conversation with parasites. But what I said about, like, that doesn't mean that you have to watch your goats die for 6 generations before they're going to do well. You just have to get your parasite management dialed in. So George says, every time I deworm a goat, should I be giving them injections of B vitamins so they start building that blood up quickly? Nope, it's not necessary. You do not need to give them B vitamins. You don't need to give them. This is one of those things where people are like, I don't know if I can afford Goats 365. And I'm like, you're going to save a lot of money when you learn, like, you've been buying. I haven't bought a bottle of B vitamins in, I don't know, over 10 years. I've never bought a bottle of red cell, and research has actually shown that red cell does not increase a goat's PCV. And that's the thing, right? Like, and I contacted the red cell company and said, can you show me the research that says, like, what dosage is needed to increase a goat's PCV? And they said, no, it's proprietary. I just love it when companies claim proprietary. So that basically means, no, you don't have any research that this product actually helps animals. You're just selling it on the hope that it will, and the fact that, like, lots of people on social media say to use it. But the research showed, and this is the thing, I see people talking about red cell all the time, and they're like, oh, 2-3 cc's. Oh, that gets rid of their anemia right away. In that red cell study, they used 30 cc's, and it did not change the PCV. So your goat doesn't need that. Like, we actually, I interviewed Dr. Van Son from Penn State. He's one of the people I interview. I talk to a lot about anything related to nutrition, and I talked to him about anemia. And he said the reason that your goat doesn't need iron or B vitamins or whatever, which he said actually B vitamins might be more helpful, but they don't need it. But anyway, they have iron stores in their liver. And so once you've killed the worms, they usually get better pretty fast because they pull iron stores from their liver. So, and I have never given a goat an injection of B12 or B vitamins. I've never given them red cell. And that includes the buck that was down for 3 weeks and then survived. I basically kept him in a stall in the barn. I fed him a 16% protein goat feed, and he got alfalfa pellets and alfalfa hay and plenty of water, and nobody to fight with him. There was another goat in a pen next to him, so he wasn't alone, but he also didn't have any competition whatsoever for food, and he couldn't stand. So nobody was stressing him out. He wasn't stressed by being alone. There's a lot of stuff involved in making sure, if an animal is really, really sick like that, there's a lot involved in making sure that mentally and physically and everything, that you're doing all the things that are needed. And this is, I want to say, probably 95% of what I tell people is based on research. And so I'm kind of like the person, I've been teaching for University of Massachusetts since 2013, which was when my first edition of Raising Goats Naturally was published, was in 2013. That's when I started teaching for UMass. And So I've seen a lot in all that time. And I want to focus on the research, because if nobody, if somebody can't tell you why something works, like, oh, I'm using apple cider vinegar. A lot of people say, have told me, especially when I had goats dying, oh, put apple cider vinegar in their water. You won't have any parasite problems. And I tried that and I still had parasite problems. But so, and nobody ever knew why. Well, apple cider, there is no science behind that. And, if you did before and after fecals, there would be no difference, assuming that you need to collect your poop directly from the goats, from the goat when they poop. And that's the thing, the before and after, and knowing that it needs to be fresh, and making sure, if your vet is doing it, making sure that nobody there left it sitting on a counter. Whenever somebody tells me they had a fecal with 0 in it, I usually feel like that fecal is not worth anything, because a goat should never, unless a goat's been living in a sterile room, they're not going to have a fecal count of 0. They have some worms in their system and they should be okay with that. Frank asked, do you advocate breeding to enhance the genetic strength of the flock? Yes, absolutely. That's what I think you came in late, because one of the things I said, sometimes people are like, wow, you're tough. I keep a lot of bucks I have like about 20 does, and I think right now I have 7 bucks. And I usually have somewhere around that number, because what I do is I choose bucks from my favorite does. So like the does who are my absolute best milkers with the best teats, the best parasite resistance, those are the bucks. I keep one of their sons, because a buck can have 20 kids in a year, whereas a doe can only have 2 or 3. I have had 9 sets of quintuplets, but 5 kids for a buck is nothing in a year. Like a buck has 10, 20, 30 kids a year. So having a good buck is your best way to improve your breeding. And in fact, one of the podcast episodes I did, actually 2 different episodes, I talked to 2 of the different authors of this study. It was an 11-year study that they did on bucks. And that's where they found some of the fattest, healthiest, happiest bucks had fecal egg counts of 2,000 eggs per gram. And they were great. And they passed that on to their offspring. The fact that they did not have a problem. They were very good at building red blood cells. They could have a lot of worms in their system, but it didn't make them sick. And I want that in my herd, or my flock with my sheep. I don't know at what point you came in, but my Shetland sheep never got dewormed again after I learned about FAMACHA. In the beginning, it was like, oh, everybody says you deworm the sheep the day you shear them. And so I did. But then 3 or 4 years into the game, I took the FAMACHA class and I was like, oh, okay. And none of my sheep ever needed a dewormer after that. And with my Katahdins, I've had Katahdins for like about 12 years now. We're 24 years on the farm. So it was 12 years with the Shetlands. And I guess I'm at 11 years with the Katahdins now, because I got sheep after 1 year instead of the first year. But anyway, the Katahdins, there was a couple lambs that I had to deworm once 1 year. That's it. Everybody else. So sheep, most breeds of sheep are naturally much more resistant and resilient to parasites. I have seen people, oh my gosh, I've had people tell me that their sheep had a fecal egg count of 5,000 or 8,000 and they're still fine. So I don't worry about a goat shedding 2,000 eggs per gram. But if you got sheep shedding 5,000 or 8,000, depending on what size they're in, like if they're doing that, you really need to be on top of your pasture rotation, because they are dumping a lot of eggs on the pasture. So anyway, the reason I keep so many bucks is because I pick my favorite bucks out of my favorite does. I take their sons, and then they're all together. If anybody needs a dewormer, they get castrated. That's it. So my bucks do great, and they pass that on to their daughters. So All right. Anything? Okay, I think that's it. And it is 20 after 9. So we will be sending this out again. And I just thought about this. Amy, are you still there? So goats365.com is where you can learn more about Goats 365. And this is the one. So right now, the special, I have a special for the next week because this is the opening of worm season. This is where all of the worm problems start, is in the spring, and they just tend to get worse over the summer. So I always have a special in April. And so if you join Goats 365 right now, which includes the parasite course, which is 7 hours, and then 5 other courses, which total over 40 hours on nutrition and health and everything. If you want to join at the monthly level, this is the link that will take you to that page that automatically has the coupon code for that. Otherwise, if you want to join at the annual level, you get a 60-minute private consultation with me. So that's, for people who want to talk about things like treating animals that have severe parasite problems, that aren't responding well to dewormers, kids that are not responding to coccidia drugs, nutrition problems, anything like that. That's what we do in those consultations. Oh, good. And Amy just popped it in the chat again. So you can click right on that in the chat and go straight to that link. So, all right. Well, I think that is it for tonight. Thank you all for attending. If you want to watch again, you will get, if you signed up for this, you will get, there, that's Amy's regular thing. You will get so if you signed up for this via email, you will get a link to your email to the replay. So if there's anything you want to rewatch, you can. And then if you were watching on YouTube, you can, the whole thing will be up there. This is being live streamed right now. So the whole thing will be up there again, will be there available really soon. So you can watch the earlier part that you missed. So thank you all for coming tonight, and good luck with your goats. Bye, everyone.